The wind howled across the barren landscape, carrying with it the chill of a winter unlike any other. Snow swirled in gusts, enveloping everything in a thick, icy silence, as if the world itself had been frozen in time. The forest surrounding the small cabin stood still, its skeletal trees etched against the pale sky. In this remote corner of the world, where civilization felt a lifetime away, wildlife thrived and struggled in equal measure, bound by the harsh rhythms of nature. For years, Sarah Dawson had called this wilderness home. A seasoned wildlife researcher, she had spent decades observing creatures in their natural habitats, documenting their behaviors, and studying the delicate balance that held their ecosystems together. The cold, the isolation, the unpredictability, they were all part of her world, and she had long ago learned to embrace it. But this particular winter had felt different. The usual patterns were disturbed. The animals were behaving strangely, and something in the air made her uneasy. One evening, as Sarah stood by her window, scanning the snow-covered terrain through binoculars, her eyes narrowed. A figure, large and unmistakable, was moving through the woods. It was a bear, but not just any bear. It was a young black bear, hunched and shivering, its fur matted with ice and snow. Sarah could see that the bear was in distress, struggling against the cold. It wasn't acting like a typical wild animal, driven only by hunger or instinct. This bear was different. It seemed to be seeking something beyond mere survival. With her heart racing, Sarah watched in disbelief as the bear moved closer to her cabin, its eyes scanning the space with an almost human-like desperation. She had seen wild animals approach homes before, but never like this. The bear paused near the door, its breath clouding in the frigid air. Then, to Sarah's astonishment, it stood up on its hind legs and gently pawed at the door, as if begging to be let inside. Frozen in place, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, not from the cold, but from the sheer vulnerability and unusual behavior of this wild creature. She had always known that animals had instincts, but she never imagined she would witness such a sight. The bear's eyes locked with hers through the window, a silent plea hanging between them. The cold was unbearable, and yet it wasn't just the freezing temperatures that made Sarah hesitate. It was the unsettling realization that this creature, so much a part of the wild, had crossed a boundary that no animal had dared to before. It was as if the bear was no longer simply a part of the wilderness, but something more, something that had learned to trust. And now, it was waiting for her to decide whether it would survive the night. Sarah's mind raced. Should she open the door? What would happen next? The woman stood speechless, her thoughts torn between the survival instincts of the animal and her own fear of the unknown. What happened next would change everything. Sarah stood motionless, staring at the bear through the frosted window, her mind racing. She had spent decades observing animals in the wild, carefully documenting their behaviors, and yet never had she encountered something like this. The bear, young and shivering, wasn't simply seeking shelter. It seemed to be asking for help. It was an unsettling and profoundly unexpected sight. Bears were solitary creatures, independent and territorial. They weren't known for their vulnerability or their capacity to show what could be interpreted as desperation. Even more troubling was the way the bear behaved once it had reached the door of her cabin. It had been pacing back and forth, its eyes scanning the landscape with a strange intensity. It wasn't hunting for food or looking for a mate. It was acting out of a primal need, one that was foreign to Sarah's scientific understanding. As the hours passed, Sarah remained by the window, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't explain why she felt an overwhelming need to help the animal. Perhaps it was the way it seemed to look directly into her eyes, its gaze full of a complex mixture of fear and trust. Sarah was no stranger to wild animals approaching human settlements. Bears were known to come near cabins in search of food, but this was different. This bear wasn't just seeking resources. It seemed to be aware of her presence, aware that she could offer something beyond mere sustenance. The bear had started to exhibit other unusual behaviors. It had tried pawing at the door once, then again, before sitting back on its haunches and staring at the cabin with an almost contemplative air. There was something strangely human about it, something that defied the typical predator-prey dynamic Sarah had studied for so long. Her instincts urged her to act, but another part of her hesitated. Was it safe? Could the bear's behavior indicate that it had been influenced by human interaction, or was there something more profound at play? Sarah had read about animals displaying empathetic tendencies before, wolves working together in ways that suggested cooperation beyond instinct, or elephants mourning the loss of one of their own, but a solitary predator like a bear displaying these signs was unheard of. Yet here it was, a bear standing at the threshold, as though it had crossed some invisible line between the wild and the human world. She remembered a study she had read a few months prior. A researcher had documented unusual behavior in a pack of wolves. The group, traditionally known for its ruthlessness in hunting and survival, had displayed what could only be interpreted as empathy when one of their own was injured. The pack had not only stopped hunting to help the wounded member, but they had actively shown concern, guiding it to a safe area, providing it with food, and even staying by its side during recovery. The study had sparked debates in the scientific community, with many arguing that such behavior was outside the realm of instinctual cooperation. Yet there was, on paper, proof that animals could, on some level, display compassion for others of their kind. Sarah had been skeptical. After all, most animal behavior could be explained by evolution and survival tactics. Empathy was a human trait, or so she thought. But now, watching the young bear through the window, Sarah began to reconsider everything she thought she knew about animal behavior. The way the bear acted, it wasn't survival instinct driving it. It wasn't hunger. It wasn't territoriality. The animal seemed to understand that it needed help, and it was showing a vulnerability she had never before observed in a predator. In all her years of studying wildlife, she had never come across a bear that seemed so willing to abandon its independence. Was this the beginning of a new chapter in her research? The thought lingered in her mind as she finally made her decision. She couldn't ignore what was happening. The bear needed assistance. But beyond that, it was clear that this wasn't just about offering shelter. It was about understanding the complex, hidden sides of animal behavior, sides that scientists like herself had long dismissed as human projections. Sarah stepped away from the window and approached the door. She opened it slowly, cautiously. The cold air rushed in, but it wasn't enough to freeze the moment unfolding before her. The bear didn't rush in as she had feared. It stayed at the threshold, its eyes locked with hers, waiting for her decision. For the first time, Sarah saw it. Not an animal seeking refuge from the cold, not a mere predator driven by instinct, but a creature that had come to her in search of something more, understanding, compassion, perhaps even connection. As the bear stepped tentatively inside the warmth of her cabin, Sarah knew she was witnessing something truly extraordinary. A moment that challenged everything she had been taught about the natural world, something that blurred the line between instinct and emotion, survival and empathy. This wasn't just an animal trying to survive the winter. It was an animal that had learned something far more profound, that sometimes survival required more than just food or shelter. It required trust, and, just perhaps, it was the beginning of something Sarah could never have imagined, an unspoken bond between two beings from vastly different worlds. The door creaked open, and the cold, biting air rushed in like an icy wave, sending a shiver through Sarah's spine. She stood frozen, her hand still on the knob, as the reality of the situation began to settle in. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch, warping into an endless expanse of uncertainty. The small cabin, once a place of solitude and safety, now felt vast and unfamiliar, as though the walls themselves were watching, holding their breath. The bear, no, it wasn't just a bear anymore, stood there, its massive frame filling the threshold, the glow of the dim interior light casting long shadows across its fur. The young creature's eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made Sarah's chest tighten. She could see the reflection of the cabin's soft warmth in the bear's dark, liquid eyes, but there was something else there, too, a raw, unguarded vulnerability that seemed almost human. The sharp, earthy scent of wild fur mingled with the faint aroma of burning wood from the stove, a reminder that despite the warmth inside, They were worlds apart in every other sense. Her heart raced. What was she doing? She was a scientist, a biologist. She had spent her career studying behavior, categorizing it, understanding it. But this didn't fit. It didn't make sense. A wild predator, a creature that lived on the fringes of civilization, standing before her, seeking her help. How could she reconcile the raw power of the bear with the fragile, almost fragile way it was acting? The sound of its breath filled the space between them, shallow and quick, like a heartbeat, an animal heart, but somehow it felt like it was the heartbeat of someone who had been lost for too long. The moments stretched on. She wanted to speak, to break the silence, but words felt inadequate. The cabin was quiet, save for the soft crackling of the fire, but the silence between them felt profound. Heavy. Sarah could feel the weight of it settling on her shoulders, pressing down on her chest. Her instinct screamed at her to retreat, to shut the door and remain safe behind the walls she had built for herself. But there was something about this bear's presence, its beseeching gaze, that made her hesitate. She glanced down at the ground, her mind searching for logic. It didn't make sense. It shouldn't make sense. She had spent years observing the boundaries between human and animal, studying how these creatures, these predators, lived according to the cold, unyielding laws of nature. They didn't seek out human interaction. They didn't beg. They didn't need the warmth of a stranger's shelter. But here it was in front of her. The bear was no longer a wild animal, a mere figure in the snow. It was standing before her, an animal unlike any other she had studied. The usual behaviors she had spent years cataloging, the territorial instincts, the hunger-driven aggression, the fight-or-flight response, none of them seemed to apply here. There was no fight in this creature. No flight. Just an aching kind of stillness, an almost silent plea. The air in the cabin seemed to thicken with the weight of Sarah's thoughts. As she inhaled, her lungs filled with a mixture of the bear's scent and the wood smoke, the warmth of the fire fighting against the chill creeping into the room. She could feel the tension in her body, the way her muscles tensed as though bracing for an impact, but none came. All she could do was stare into those eyes, dark, wet pools of uncertainty and yearning. There was something in those eyes that mirrored her own confusion. In them, she saw a flicker of something wild, something primal, yet it was tempered by a flicker of something softer, something almost tender. The longer she stood there, the more her emotions began to swell. Astonishment gave way to confusion, and confusion to awe. She had expected many things when she had opened the door, perhaps a warning growl, a violent swipe of the claws, but not this. Not the quiet trust that seemed to hang in the air like an invisible thread between them. The bear was waiting for her, not with the aggressive posture of a predator, but with the quiet patience of a creature that knew it had to take a risk, a leap of faith. Tears began to prick the corners of Sarah's eyes, unbidden. The weight of the moment pressed in on her chest, not from fear, but from a profound recognition that she was witnessing something beyond the scope of her understanding. She had always known that the animal kingdom was filled with complexities, that the boundaries between instinct and emotion were far from clear-cut. But this was something else entirely. It was a kind of reckoning, a reminder that nature was not always predictable, not always governed by cold rules. There was room for something beyond survival, room for connection. The bear, as though sensing her shift in energy, took a tentative step forward, its massive body gliding into the warm light of the cabin. The sound of its heavy paws against the wooden floor seemed to echo in the small space. Sarah's breath quickened, but she didn't move. She couldn't. It was as though her very soul was rooted to the spot, caught in the extraordinary gravity of the moment. The soft rustle of the bear's fur, the warmth of its breath filling the air between them. It all seemed so surreal. With each step the bear took, the walls around Sarah seemed to crumble just a little more. She had spent so much of her life categorizing, classifying, and observing. But now, in the presence of this creature, she felt small, insignificant. The animal's quiet request, its unspoken vulnerability, shattered the walls she had carefully constructed around her own heart. She was no longer just a scientist. She was a human being, standing face to face with a creature that defied everything she thought she knew about the natural world. Her pulse hammered in her ears as the bear reached her, its body close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from it. For a moment, neither of them moved. Time seemed to hold its breath, and in that stillness, Sarah's emotions swirled like the snow outside, bewildering, uncontainable, and yet somehow beautiful. There, in the quiet, she realized that she was no longer the observer. She was the one being observed, and in that gaze, she saw something she could hardly comprehend, a silent, desperate hope. The bear's heavy breath seemed to fill the room, each exhale creating a soft mist in the air. Its dark eyes remained locked on Sarah's, unwavering. The silence between them was thick, pregnant with a sense of waiting. The animal had taken another step forward, its massive frame now so close that Sarah could feel the heat radiating from it, a stark contrast to the bitter cold that clung to the window panes behind her. There, in that shared space, it wasn't just a predator and prey. It was something deeper, more intimate, something unspoken. Sarah's mind was racing, desperately seeking answers that didn't exist. She had always been taught that animals, even the ones with intelligence and social structure, operated primarily on instincts, survival, hunger, territory. That was the order of nature. Humans had learned to separate themselves from that world, to live above it, to understand it, but never to truly be part of it. That was the story she had always told herself, the story that had made sense of her world. But now, standing before this bear, the foundation of everything she knew was cracking. She could feel it, this strange, undeniable bond that stretched across species, across the barriers she had so carefully erected. The bear's large, wet nose twitched, as if scenting the air. Then it took a deep, slow breath, its chest rising and falling with a steady rhythm. There was something so profoundly calm about its movements, as though it had finally accepted that it was in the right place. This wasn't just a creature looking for warmth. It was seeking connection. Something beyond survival. Something, Sarah realized with growing awe, that she had been blind to all her life. It was then that the bear did something she would never have expected. Rather than simply curling up to rest, as Sarah had anticipated, the animal turned slightly, its massive body angled toward the stove. With deliberate care, it sat down on the floor, its back to her, as if it were now content to simply be in her presence. The movement was slow, almost deliberate. The bear's posture, usually tense and alert in the wild, was relaxed. For a moment, Sarah could hear nothing but the crackling of the fire, the soft hiss of the logs shifting in the stove. Her mind struggled to make sense of what she was seeing. She had expected a predator's behavior, unpredictable, dangerous, hungry. Instead, she was confronted with the unexpected calm of an animal that seemed peaceful, almost as though it were comfortable, as if it had known for a long time that this moment was coming. Sarah's heart clenched. She took a step closer, her feet quiet on the wooden floor. The air between them felt different now, no longer thick with uncertainty, but full of a strange, palpable understanding. The bear's eyes flicked up to hers, and for the briefest moment, she saw it again, the vulnerability, the longing, the silent plea that had led it to her door. And yet, now there was something else. It was as if the bear had found solace, not in the warmth of the cabin alone, but in the quiet connection they had forged in this shared space. Without thinking, Sarah sat down across from the bear, her back against the wall. The silence felt less like a void now, and more like the soft hum of something ancient, something timeless. She could hear the soft scrape of the bear's claws against the floor as it shifted, its massive body lowering into a more comfortable position. For the first time in what felt like ages, Sarah let go of the tight grip on her own emotions. The calm was contagious. She let out a long breath, feeling her tension slowly melt away. It wasn't until much later that evening, as the fire began to burn low and the first few stars began to twinkle outside, that Sarah realized the bear hadn't been seeking refuge. Not entirely. What had drawn it to her was not just the need for survival, but something more profound, a yearning for warmth that transcended the physical. The warmth of companionship, of understanding. The bear had crossed the threshold not only of her home, but of the invisible boundary that separated humans from animals. It had recognized something in her, a shared need for connection. Sarah thought back to the studies she had read over the years, the discussions she had had with colleagues who had argued that animals were nothing more than creatures driven by instinct. But here in front of her was evidence of something deeper. The bear had sought her out not for food, not for protection from the elements, but because, in its silent plea, it had shown an awareness that connected them as beings with emotions, fears, and desires that went beyond survival. The realization hit Sarah like a wave. The line she had drawn between humans and animals, between intellect and instinct, had always been artificial. The bear, in all its primal strength, had shown her the flaw in that thinking. There was a shared consciousness, a shared emotional depth that bound them in ways she had never before considered. She leaned back, her eyes never leaving the bear. It had found comfort in her presence, and in doing so, had changed her perception of the wild. The animal world was not an indifferent realm of survival and dominance, as she had always assumed. It was a realm of connection, of understanding that crossed species, that bridged the vast chasm between human and animal. In the quiet presence of this bear, Sarah had come to realize that the wild was not so wild after all. It was a reflection of the very human emotions she had long thought to be uniquely her own. As the bear closed its eyes and drifted into a peaceful slumber, Sarah allowed herself a moment of awe. This was no longer just a study, no longer just an experiment in wildlife observation. This was a profound, life-altering moment, a realization that, perhaps, the boundaries she had spent her career defining were not as solid as she once believed. There was a depth to the natural world, an emotional current that flowed through every living thing. And for the first time, Sarah felt a part of it. And as she sat there, watching the fire flicker and listening to the gentle breathing of the bear beside her, she knew she had changed. Forever. The days that followed were filled with a quiet intensity. The bear had stayed in Sarah's cabin for several days, coming and going as it pleased, always returning to the warmth and safety of the room where Sarah spent her time reflecting. During these days, Sarah had observed the animal with a mix of awe and uncertainty. She had never thought of herself as someone to base conclusions solely on emotion, but the connection she felt with the bear was undeniable, and it challenged everything she had known about wildlife behavior. As a seasoned biologist, Sarah had spent her career cataloging the instincts and behaviors of animals. She had followed the prevailing scientific views that animals, particularly predators, acted primarily out of instinct, driven by hunger, fear, and territory. It was a framework that had worked for decades, shaping her understanding of the natural world. The study of animal behavior, particularly in the wild, was governed by one central idea: survival of the fittest. Yet the bear, in all its raw power, had shown Sarah something else entirely, something that defied logic. It wasn't the survival instinct driving its actions. It was something more complex, a quiet need for connection, for understanding, that went beyond instinct. The bear's behavior lingered in Sarah's mind, gnawing at her. She could no longer ignore the implications of what she had witnessed. If this young bear, a creature that should have been guided purely by survival, had shown the capacity for empathy, for trust, then what else had she missed? How many other animals were capable of emotions and behaviors that had been dismissed or overlooked? Sarah realized she couldn't just walk away from this revelation. She knew the scientific community would be skeptical. The prevailing theories on animal behavior were deeply rooted in the idea that animals acted purely on instinct. Anything outside that framework was often dismissed as anthropomorphism, attributing human qualities to animals. But Sarah had seen it with her own eyes. She had witnessed a predator acting with an emotional depth that simply couldn't be explained away by survival tactics. Determined to understand more, Sarah began researching animal empathy, trust, and social behaviors across species. She reached out to colleagues and other researchers, sharing her experience and asking them to reconsider their assumptions. Some were receptive, intrigued by her first-hand account of the bear's behavior, while others remained dismissive. But the seed had been planted. There were others in the scientific community who were beginning to look beyond instinct and survival to explore deeper, emotional connections within animal species. Sarah's work soon shifted direction. Her papers, once filled with data on territorial behaviors and feeding patterns, began to examine the emotional and social complexities of animals. She started documenting cases of unexpected animal empathy and cooperation, diving into studies that suggested that behaviors like nurturing, mourning, and even compassion could be present in more species than previously thought. The bear's behavior wasn't an anomaly. It was a sign of something far more profound. She began to challenge the established boundaries between human and animal behavior, proposing that animals were far more aware of each other, and even humans, than scientists had previously understood. But the transformation in Sarah wasn't just academic. The experience had shaken her to her core, forcing her to reconsider her own place in the natural world. She had spent years as an observer, detached from the animals she studied, but the bear had changed that. She realized that, as a scientist, she had always viewed nature from a distance, cold, analytical, and removed. But now, she felt a deeper connection to the world she had dedicated her life to understanding. It wasn't just about research anymore. It was about compassion, about recognizing that humans and animals shared something essential, a capacity for connection, for empathy. Her newfound perspective began to shape the way she interacted with the world. She was no longer just a researcher in a distant, sterile laboratory. She was a person deeply connected to the creatures she had once only observed. Her approach to her work became more holistic, emphasizing the emotional and social needs of animals, and this shift began to influence her collaborations with conservation organizations and policymakers. As Sarah's work gained attention, public attitudes toward wildlife began to shift as well. There was a growing interest in the idea that animals weren't mere creatures of instinct, but sentient beings capable of understanding, feeling, and connecting. Policies regarding animal rights and conservation were affected by this new perspective, and slowly, the scientific community began to embrace a more nuanced understanding of animal behavior. For Sarah, the journey that began with one extraordinary bear had fundamentally altered the course of her career and her life. No longer just a scientist studying animal behavior, she had become an advocate for recognizing the depth of connection between humans and the natural world. The walls between them, once so rigid and impenetrable, had crumbled, leaving behind a new, shared understanding. The event had shifted her worldview, teaching her that the boundaries between species were not as clear-cut as she had once believed. And as she looked out into the wilderness, her heart filled with a quiet, profound sense of gratitude for the bear that had shown her the way. The quiet reverberations of that singular encounter with the bear stretched far beyond Sarah's cabin, rippling through her career and the world she had once viewed as separate and distinct from humanity. The bear's presence, its unexpected trust, had not only altered her approach to research, but had sparked a broader shift in how society viewed the animal kingdom. What had once been a world of cold statistics and detached observation was now alive with possibility. A world where empathy, emotion, and deep connection weren't the exclusive domain of humans, but shared with the creatures that roamed the earth alongside them. As Sarah's research gained traction, so did the movement to rethink animal behavior. Conservation organizations began to adopt a more compassionate, inclusive approach to the species they worked to protect. It wasn't enough to preserve habitats or protect endangered species. Humans had to acknowledge the complexity and emotional depth of the animals they were saving. Policy changes followed, with new emphasis placed on animal welfare, the emotional intelligence of wildlife, and the importance of understanding and protecting their psychological needs. Legislation began to shift toward more ethical treatment and better habitats for wildlife, driven by a growing recognition that animals were sentient beings deserving of respect and compassion, not just preservation. Sarah's story and her transformation became a rallying cry for other researchers and conservationists to embrace a more holistic understanding of the natural world. New studies emerged, exploring animal emotions, cooperation, and empathy, leading to more nuanced findings about the behaviors that once seemed so foreign to humans. The walls that had divided human consciousness from that of the animal kingdom were slowly crumbling. And in their place, new opportunities for collaboration and coexistence were being built. But perhaps the most profound transformation was within Sarah herself. The world she once saw as a place to study from afar was now something she felt deeply connected to. Her work was no longer confined to the cold equations of biology or the sterile walls of a research lab. It had become a living, breathing expression of the very relationship she had forged with the bear. The connection between them, once so small, so simple, had become a larger truth. Humans and animals were not so different after all. They shared an innate need for connection, understanding, and empathy. As Sarah watched the sun set over the wilderness, the very same landscape where she had once viewed animals as distant and untouchable, she felt a deep sense of peace. She no longer saw herself as an outsider looking in, but as a part of this world, forever intertwined with it. The bear had shown her that nature wasn't just something to observe from a distance. It was something to be a part of, something to cherish. In that quiet moment, Sarah knew that her work was far from over. There was so much more to learn, so much more to understand about the emotional and cognitive depths of the creatures with whom we share this planet. And as the world shifted, as public attitudes toward animals and conservation evolved, she knew that the transformation sparked by one bear's silent plea would continue to echo for generations to come. The world was no longer divided into us and them. There was just one vast, interconnected ecosystem, and it was a little bit more human, a little bit more empathetic because of the bond she had witnessed.